If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon, link is in the description.
Chapter 561, Awakening. The seal was still present in the crystal, but Nick knew that the god within was awake now. There was no hostility from the gaze though, but rather a sort of curiosity and confusion. "What are you?" a deep rumble echoed throughout the chamber in an unusual manner that Nick had trouble understanding. It was as if the god had spoken through the very fabric of the world itself rather than with a true verbal method. "I am what you see and yet more as well." Nick spoke in reply nervously. "So you do not know then?" the being replied with a clear amount of amusement. "Are you Hephaestus?" Nick decided to ask bluntly, since the answer determined his next actions. If this was Zeus instead of the forge god like he thought, then he was going to leave immediately and begin setting traps all over this place. "How do you know that name?" The question sounded calm, but Nick could feel the caution in it as well. "That is but a single of the names that was remembered by humanity belonging to the gods. That name in particular fit the properties of the energy you have released over the years," Nick said truthfully. The god remained silent for a few moments after Nick spoke, and he could feel the gaze on him intensify as if searching for any sign of deception. "I am indeed Hephaestus. What do the humans remember of us?" the god asked with perceivable hope. Nick also noticed that the name was spoken in a clear manner which showed the god's familiarity with it. Thanks to this, he was fairly certain that this truly was the forge god, and he chose to tell the truth. "Few of you gods are remembered in a positive light, and most records of you all state you as arrogant, cruel, and powerful in all but a handful of cases. You specifically are one such case, as you have few recorded cases of cruelty or arrogance," Nick said honestly. There was silence for an entire minute at this before the god spoke again. "That is not an inaccurate record of those events," they said with what Nick could only assume was shame. It was an odd thing for him to witness, as of all the traits that the gods were shown to exhibit, shame was not a common one at all. "Not to be rude or anything, but might you be able to tell me when you will free yourself from your seal? I need a rough timeline to prepare for the others' return as well," Nick said seriously. "Others?" the god questioned in surprise and worry. Nick nodded. "Zeus and Hestia are also alive and within seals as well," he explained calmly. "Zeus? How?" The god lost control of their emotions clearly as the chamber shook from their speech, and Nick had trouble remaining standing from the pressure placed on him. "I don't know how Zeus did it, only that it happened," he said honestly. "This is grave news. I will need to remove the seal early," the god said, catching Nick totally off guard as the crystal started to tremble and crack while the molten metal was getting absorbed into it in vast amounts. Nick could only watch in shock as the molten lake slowly vanished into the crystal that broke apart as well over the course of the next day. Within the crystal was a bright light that he couldn't see through, but that faded away the moment the last drop of the molten lake sank into it. Floating in mid-air was a female figure with bronze-colored skin stretched over a lithe toned body that had short red hair and a bad scar on the left side of the face. A woman, Nick thought in shock as the figure floated down and softly landed on the two bare feet with wobbly balance. "Here," Nick said as he tossed some clothes to the figure from the realm that were likely to cover them equally while looking away. "You speak AEIs?" The figure spoke in a soft voice that made him shiver, not from it being sensual or anything but because of the sheer power of each word. "I speak all languages," Nick answered honestly. "A very practical ability, strange one," the figure said while Nick heard the sound of clothes getting put on. "Nicholas or Nick if you prefer," Nick said, and the figure looked confused. "What do you mean?" she asked calmly. "My name, Nicholas, or Nick for short," he explained, and the woman seemed to understand. "I see, I require lodging and access to records from when I sealed myself, strange Nick," she said calmly, making Nick's face twitch a little. 27. Chapter 562, Showing Around. "First it just Nick, second no one has records from when you were sealed away, best we have is about 3 or 4,000 years ago. As for lodging, I have a place that should work just fine so long as you don't go messing with stuff," Nick said, and the goddess frowned. "Less than optimal, but it will have to suffice. Lead the way, strange Nick," she said with a small smile at the end. Nick could only sigh before changing to his animagus form and teleporting to his island. This was actually a small test on his part to see if she could follow him through space itself, since if not, then it would be a viable escape method from Zeus. "I do not recognize this creature you have taken the form of. What is it?" the goddess asked curiously from right next to him in mid-air. "I think I may have underestimated what a god was capable of," Nick thought, more than a little bothered by how easy she followed him. Keying her into the ward, Nick descended from the sky towards the manor with the goddess casually following behind him. After landing, Nick turned back to normal before addressing the question he was asked. That is a celestial bird, the natural offspring of a phoenix and a thunderbird. It can also be considered another true form of mine. He explained honestly. It surprises me to learn that those two prideful creatures would have an offspring. Hestia and Zeus's favored beasts usually avoided each other in my time. The goddess said, giving Nick a piece of information that he didn't previously have. He assumed that thunderbirds had some sort of tie to Zeus given the massive overlap between the two, but the fact that Hestia was tied to phoenixes was new. Not too surprising though, considering Hestia was considered the keeper of the eternal flame of Olympus, so the tie was easy enough to see. This residence is also rather humble, is it not? In my time a great mage would live in grand palaces of marble and gold. The goddess said, looking the manner with clear surprise. I don't need so much space for living since I am a craftsman before all else. Nick said honestly, and he noticed the goddess's eyes lit up in excitement when he said that. You have a forge then? She asked enthusiastically. I have a forge and enchantment room for whatever I happen to be working on at any given moment. Nick said honestly. I would like access to these places. She said with big pleading eyes that worked uncomfortably well at making him want to say yes immediately. You should acquaint yourself with the history of the world in your absence first. We can speak more on the matter after that. Nick said while trying to maintain a straight face. He wasn't sure why exactly, but he felt strange looking at her and it bothered him greatly. I understand. She said with a bit of a pout, which Nick tried to ignore as he gave her a tour of the manor. The library had of course been updated and organized with the copies he made of the Hogwarts books as well as the things he got from the Room of Hidden Things. The room had an expanded space to accommodate it all, but was a sight to see. The goddess paused when Nick showed her the crafting rooms and seemed especially surprised to see the astral tools that he had neatly organized in the room he converted to his metal working area. She didn't linger there for too long however, and continued with the tour of the manor, which actually led to an encounter between her and Dottie. What sort of creature are you? She asked bluntly. This one is Dottie, first of the Hyldra and servant to my lord Nicholas Ravenclaw. The servant said with a polite bow. Hyldra? Is that what he is? The goddess asked while looking at Nick. Perish the thought. This one's master is of a higher existence than I. Dottie said seriously. Is that so? The goddess muttered with a thoughtful look. My race does not technically have a name, but the general categorization of Dottie's and my races is Daedra. Dottie gained their own race due to the magical bond we share, in fact as a sort of bleed over from my own race. Nick explained honestly. I see. So your race truly must be of a higher order to cause such a change in those connected to you. The goddess said in understanding. I suppose you could consider that to be the case. Enough on that though, there is still more to show you. Nick said before continuing the tour. 5. Chapter 563, Truth. Eventually Nick finished the tour of the manor with the guest room that he was going to let her use for as long as she wished. It will serve my purposes well enough. She said blandly after looking over the room. That reminds me, but can I ask why your form is female? The records I have all allude to you being male in nature. Nick said, finally unable to resist the urge to know what was going on. She actually looked sad at this question, which told him this next bit would be unpleasant. I was born with the crafting and metal domains, which were until then believed to be male-oriented domains. Admittedly, they do indeed suit males better in general due to the innate advantages in body structure. My progenitor, Zeus, was enraged at this as he believed it a slight against him by fate. He thus burnt my visage and decreed that I would only be described as and treated as though I was male. She explained before looking at Nick for his reaction, only to be surprised to see a look of anger on his face. It would seem the records don't do Zeus justice, as he is even worse than depicted, and as you'll no doubt come to realize, that is a very bad image already. Honestly, what sort of monster would treat their own child in such a way for no good reason, a beautiful daughter no less? Nick fumed, and the goddess looked at him in a new way. Zeus is not a being to be mocked or disobeyed lightly. She warned seriously. Why should I be afraid when I am already likely to clash with him upon his return? Nick said with a scoff. Her eyes widened. Why would you clash with him? You draw close to the limits of mortality but are not yet a god, so he shouldn't concern himself with you upon his return. She said, confused. This should serve as reason enough to believe otherwise. Nick said while taking out the book that Kronos had written to show her. This is an ancient text older than even I am. She said seriously before opening it to read its contents. A written prophecy by Zeus's progenitor. I knew that he was a grand seer, but nothing ever this far-flung about the future. She breathed out in shock. Yes, and from what I gather he saw far more than a single timeline into the future as well. I can't even imagine the sort of strain such a thing might place on one. Nick said honestly. This was true as well as even in the cases of Grindelwald and Trelawney. Merely seeing a single timeline a few years in the future left them in a wretched state afterwards. Compared to what Kronos did by seeing tens of thousands of years into the future on multiple timelines, that backlash was probably next to nothing. Indeed, it was why Apollo bound his own gift of foresight to a human. This allowed him to not suffer the backlash whenever it created a prophecy. The goddess said seriously. I am not surprised to learn of Hades' survival to this date using a different method than we did. He was always a mysterious individual that rarely interacted with the world beyond his realm. She added after finishing the book and returning it to Nick. This information changes things considerably. If Zeus's progenitor believed you capable of vying for hegemony with Zeus, then I shall place my trust in your potential. She added while making eye contact. For now though you should focus on catching up, since I imagine Zeus will only return in a year or so. After all, I doubt that he has a vast reservoir of mana attuned to himself to absorb, unlike you. Nick said, pointing out the trick she used to shake off the weakness that should have come from being unsealed early. It was quite clever actually, as she gambled that the mana levels would return to normal before she died and placed a tiny gap in the seal to allow the molten metal to be created and accumulate over time around her seal. The metal being created by mana attuned to her thus allowed her to reabsorb to metal as pure energy that removed her weakness in an instant. To put it simply, she made it so that she could unseal herself whenever she wanted after the mana returned to comfortable levels. If she did so early, then she shook off the weakness that came with that. But if she undid the seal slowly like she would have normally, she would gain a boost of extra power beyond her peak by absorbing the metal. 20. Chapter 564, Hostile Intentions. After that, Hephaestus practically lived within the library and regularly received sweets from Dottie, since she apparently had a huge sweet tooth. Nick would have thought it funny if the woman didn't have an appetite way bigger than her lithe-toned frame would make you think. She was by no means a big woman, as she only stood at about 5 foot 7 inches and had a deceptively narrow body. Despite this, she ate nearly her body weight in food without any issue at all before going back to the books in the library. Nick had other things to worry about, however, as the same day he brought her back to the manor he received news that a few war bands were starting to test the edges of his defenses for weaknesses. If I went and made an example out of them, how badly do you think everyone would take it? Nick asked Sirius, who was working as the head of the Adventurers Guild and People's representative to Nick at the moment. The man saw the way that London was going under the ministry that could now act more tyrannical, and moved his family homeland and all to Nick's area since it was a better option. Nick had been putting him to work since then and was at the moment in a meeting with him about these war bands trying his patience. It wouldn't go over well if we made the first move. A lot of people are still stuck in the way things used to be and aren't willing to accept such a violent approach, even if I personally think it a good one. Sirius said honestly. I thought so. I don't want to wait for an attack to justify retaliation though. Any suggestions? Nick asked with a sigh. Got anything flashy but mostly harmless that would serve as a warning? Sirius asked, and Nick thought about it for a moment. Well, I could send a huge murder of crow beasts to pester them. He offered, and Sirius immediately shook his head. It might look like a biological attack if you did that, since the crows tend to carry diseases with them. He said, and Nick cursed himself for not taking that into account. I could always create a storm to soak them away. Nick suggested. So long as you keep any lightning out of it, that should do the trick. We would need someone to keep an eye on them to make sure they don't try to pull a fast one for that whole time though. Sirius said after some thought on it. Send the twins, they've been badgering me about trying out some new prank items since they got here after they graduated. Nick said with a smirk. The twins saw how bad it was in Diagon Alley when they went to set up a shop and decided to try their luck at Nick's new settlement, which had panned out really well for them so far. Their shop was a local favorite as they sold magical props to the muggles living here as well as the wizards, so they got regular high-volume business as the muggles kept coming back for more. They even had a few muggles working in their shop happily, which admittedly helped considerably as most wizards were rather standoffish with muggles still, so things were tense. The twins' shop helps break down this tension a lot, which Nick was all for. Sirius grinned and ended the meeting there since he needed to let everyone know the plan. The next day Nick donned his armor and flew out of the island and purposefully over the settlement as the twins flew up to meet him. The 3 war bands were smart and made sure they were in 3 separate locations a few miles away from the edge of his area. Nick made sure that they saw him above them as he flared his magic and summoned a downpour on them. A few wizards tried to take him down while he was there, but they got harsh lessons as he turned them into donkeys. Really made an ass of themselves, hey? Fred joked at this and the 3 of them laughed at the joke. All right you two, if they try to leave the storms without actually going away, let me know so I can have the rain chase them," Nick said, and the twins saluted in an exaggerated manner. With that done, Nick went back to the island to get back to his paperwork while his second body worked on another project of his, the lexicon. 6. Chapter 565, Dwemer Intrigue. As both bodies were Nick's, he could in fact multitask using them, and as it turned out, the Dwemer was more cautious than expected. Rather than stuffing all the knowledge within it into the head of whoever tried to read it, the small cube only took out a single tome's worth of information at a time before it needed to be activated again. In a way, Nick had to admit that it made sense, as the Dwemer wanted to protect its knowledge from being lost, so obviously it wouldn't do if the method used caused the person reading it to go brain dead. Nick was more than happy about this, as it meant he could slowly assimilate the knowledge within the lexicon without worrying about the mind of his body getting fried. Daedric brains were durable, but if you suddenly shoved hundreds if not thousands of years worth of knowledge into it, and that durability was bound to be overwhelmed. Nick wasn't worried about his own mind getting damaged, as it was connected to his essence, which was not entirely present in the bodies he piloted. If one of them get overloaded like that, he would get a bit of backlash but would otherwise be unbothered by it. There was one rule that sort of limited his ability to multitask, however, in that he can only control one body in one realm, so both of his bodies have to be in a different realm if he wants to control them both at the same time. Still, that rule was not a problem at all, since any sort of multitasking was better than none at all. As for the knowledge that the Dwemer put into the lexicon, it would be better to ask what wasn't there. Daedric anatomy, crafting techniques, geology, herbology, high-end mathematics, you think of any subject and the lexicon held at least something on it. The part that got Nick excited though was when a chunk of knowledge regarding tonal magic popped up. Tonal magic was a fascinating subject that very few on Nirn ever learned even a little of, as the Dwemer were highly protective of it. The idea was basically that all things had a sort of tone to them, and if you could recreate that tone, you could in theory recreate that thing in its entirety. There was more to it than that obviously, but that was the basic premise of the magic. The Dwemer were especially prodigious at this form of magic, as it was even the way by which Kagrenak zero-summed the entire race. By messing with the tone of a god's heart and trying to fuse it with that of the tone of the Dwemer race. More likely than not, he was actually intending on forcefully ascending himself to divinity to fight off those attacking at the time, but ended up dragging the rest of the race in the realm alongside him to non-existence. It was an arrogant thing to try and steal a god's divinity to force oneself to that level, and Kagrenak paid the price for it. But that was an extreme example of tonal magic, when the best use of it was in another more subtle way, resonance. By creating a tonal resonance, one could make nearly any piece of magic or enchantment dozens of times more powerful. It was a bit like turning up the volume on a speaker to make music louder. The music itself doesn't really change, but it carries further and can be heard more clearly, like it had changed. Nick wanted tonal magic specifically for the uses in crafting that it would have that would let him take another step forward on that path. His crafting domain was going in an entirely different direction than any other craftsman before him, so it likely felt totally different than Hephaestus's own. Magical beings with similar domains felt it after a certain level of power, and yet Hephaestus was entirely caught off guard by the reveal that he was a craftsman. Nick couldn't blame her, since even he couldn't feel her crafting domain, as they were nothing alike. Nick's domain was made of each of his styles and his experiences with them, as well as what he has created on his own or learned from others. As a result, it was full of concepts and things that weren't from this world or even the same world as each other, so there was no one in the world with a similar crafting domain. What he did share with Hephaestus, however, was a fire domain, as they both walked a similar path in that regard, though with her obviously being much further ahead of him in it. 19. Chapter 566, Misunderstanding and Pleased Goddess. 3 days after Nick created the rainstorms over the war bands to shoo them away, Hephaestus eagerly approached him. "I have completed all of the tomes within your archive, I would like to use the crafting rooms now," she said eagerly. Nick froze mid-quill stroke when he heard this. "I'm sorry, I think I misheard you. Did you say you completed everything in my library?" he asked in disbelief. "Indeed. I would like access to the crafting rooms now," she said eagerly. Nick frankly didn't believe her, but after asking a few questions he couldn't deny that she actually read through the whole collection of information he had in the library. "Fine, you may use the crafting rooms, but try not to destroy anything in the process, some of that equipment was hard to get after all," Nick said with a sigh, and the goddess practically skipped out of his office in joy. "I hope she doesn't go too crazy in there," he thought worriedly. He had a lot of valuable materials stocked up and really didn't want them to get destroyed because the goddess decided to craft a weapon to split the sea or some such other needlessly overpowered item. No more than an hour later, the red-haired goddess came back to the office with a confused expression. "Is something the matter?" Nick asked, concerned seeing this. "I cannot understand the purpose of many of the tools you have in the forging room," I require assistance. She said honestly. Give me a moment to finish up here and I'll try to explain them all. Nick said calmly before turning his attention back to the paperwork that he had to do. Running a settlement took a lot of work after all. About 10 minutes later Nick finished his work and got up to head over to the forge room. Hephaestus followed him closely and to his surprise looped her arm under his own to hold his hand. What are you doing? He exclaimed while distancing himself from her in shock. She looked confused. Are you not hosting me in the attempt to mate with me? She asked casually and Nick shook his head. What on earth gave you that idea? He asked, fearing there may have been some sort of misunderstanding. I fail to understand why else you would be willing to inconvenience yourself like this otherwise. She said honestly. Nick finally understood where the problem was when she said this and sighed. I should have considered that the way the world worked in your time was different than it currently does. While I will freely admit to feeling attracted to you, that has nothing to do with why I am allowing you to stay here. The truth is simply because it made the most sense to do so. At this moment there is probably only a handful of beings that can even understand you on this planet, and out of all of them I trust a single one not to try and use you for their own agendas. Nick explained seriously. She frowned at this. I fail to understand. She admitted honestly. Perhaps you are unaware of it, but at this exact moment there is not a single being on the entire planet that could stop you if you wanted to do something. While I am not entirely sure which tier you as a god are at, I do know that the highest being alive other than you at the moment is merely a low tier 5. Rather than allow you to be used for others' gain, I figure it would be best to keep you here out of the world's attention and unburdened by expectations that you don't deserve. Nick said honestly. In other words, I want nothing from you at all in exchange for you staying as a guest. He added to clarify. But you do find me attractive then, despite this. She said while motioning to her scarred face. Out of everything I just said, you focused on that? Yes, you are attractive, annoyingly so considering I don't have the time to entertain such a thing. Nick said with a huff. I have not been desired before. It is pleasant. She said with a smile. Whatever floats your boat, I guess. Nick said before leading the way to the crafting room with her hanging off his arm, pleased with herself. After getting there he spent the next few hours explaining the equipment to her, which she understood after a single example of it in use was given. She then proceeded to make him feel bad by pointing out how horrible the high-end equipment was compared to the forge she used to have. 4. Chapter 567, Nature of Gods. Nick knew that the goddess would have likely had an incredible setup for her own workshop, but it was frankly nuts how exaggerated it was. The only thing she was genuinely impressed with were the astral equipment and the stuff that Nick used for his otherworldly crafting styles. The rest of it was too humble in her opinion. In a way it was infuriating to hear for Nick, but he understood that she wasn't being malicious in her criticism. Much of what you are referring to has been lost to time after your fall. This was our best recreations of them so far. Nick explained after hearing enough. What do you mean? She asked, confused. Magical beings, as it turned out, aren't very fond of writing down or sharing their knowledge with the rest of the world. This meant that all we have had to work with after your fall was the leftover equipment and the scant few records of them that existed. Unfortunately, much of this too was lost for various reasons as history marched on and magical beings slowly advanced magical understanding again. Nick explained honestly. I see. That explains why there was a confounding lack of higher knowledge within your library. Much within it was even incomplete or false in certain circumstances. Hephaestus said with an understanding look. Nick wasn't surprised to hear this, since he himself had spotted a few inconsistencies or falsities in the various sources of information he had gone through. The problem, however, was the difficulty in proving which, if either, was the correct direction for the information. Nick frankly didn't have the time required to perform the hundreds or thousands of experiments needed to prove or disprove all of them. Now, however, he didn't need to if he could get Hephaestus to share her own knowledge. He briefly considered playing the emotional angle, as the woman was clearly starved for positive encounters regarding her gender and thus was uniquely vulnerable from that angle, but he chose to discard that idea immediately. He was many things, but needlessly cruel couldn't be considered one of them, and that was precisely what that course of action was. If she was an enemy and it gave him an advantage, then he wouldn't have hesitated, but she was not an enemy and might even be considered an ally. In the end, Nick chose to approach the matter in a straightforward manner, as he deemed that the best in this case. Could you teach me what you know? He asked calmly. I will share what I can, but please do know that magic is not my domain, so I will likely make an inadequate teacher. It is unfortunate that Hecate did not survive our fall, as she would no doubt prove best at repairing the loss of knowledge that has occurred. The goddess said without any hesitation. Nick noted that if anything she seemed more relaxed after he had asked her to teach him. Let us start from the beginning then. What is magic and where does it come from? She then went on to give a long lecture on magic as she understood it that lasted nearly 2 whole weeks. Nick was forced to allow her into his realm so that she could have his focus while he could still take care of the things that his settlement needed. Once she was within his realm, however, she quickly discovered his true nature. She was totally fine with it as well, and if anything it made her eager to get closer to him as she was much more energetic after learning it. Nick asked about this and was surprised to learn that his state as a realm lord was actually very similar to the natural state of the gods in that they were both comprised of pure energy. That was the secret behind their supposed immortality. Their bodies were comprised of pure energy, so any mortal wounds inflicted only discorporate them instead of doing actual harm. The downside, however, was that they were also uniquely vulnerable to soul-based attacks once their bodies were killed, unlike Nick, who was actually strongest without a body. Hephaestus freely shared this information because according to her it would prove highly valuable when Zeus returned and came to attack Nick. Hephaestus also revealed the tier that gods like her and Zeus stood at, as well as the 2 tiers before godhood. Tier 7 was the starting point for godhood, and ironically the highest any god obtained due to them not seeking greater power after the Titans were defeated. Yes, defeated. Many of the old Titans had not been killed unlike Kronos, but rather reduced to soul forms and imprisoned within the depths of the realm of the dead that Hades ruled. Chapter 568, First Meeting. Not only had she finished teaching Nick the parts he was missing and then correcting those he had wrong, but also let him advance his plans against Zeus. On the final day of this time though, there was a bit of a commotion as Nazgul returned from wherever she had been this whole time. She had simply left shortly after Grindelwald completed his ritual, and Nick hadn't bothered to try and figure out where she went since he could feel that she was fine through their bond. That said, he also wasn't aware that she was coming back and thus couldn't warn those living in his settlement. Nazgul might be a beautiful creature, but she was also the size of a large dragon and extremely powerful. So when the scouts reported her approach, the alarms went off and it was all hands on deck as they prepared to confront the powerful beast that had shown up. Nick had donned his armor and was floating in the air outside his settlement's walls to wait for this unknown creature. When he saw her, however, he laughed and told everyone to stand down, which confused many until Nazgul crashed into him and chirped affectionately as she rubbed her head against his chest. "You must have been eating well, girl, you've grown," Nick said with a wide smile as he gave her attention, much to the dumbfounded looks of many of his settlement's residents. Sir, can you explain your relation with this creature?" one of the Muggle guardsmen asked respectfully, but also with more than a little fear towards Nazgul. "Right, I totally forgot to make that public, what with the way the world has been recently. Anyways, this beautiful creature here is my familiar, Nazgul. She was born from an experiment I made while I was trying to give ghosts corporeal forms and is an absolute sweetheart, so no need to be afraid of her at all," Nick said without looking away from Nazgul. As if to prove his point, Sirius walked out of the crowd and scratched her under her horns without any hesitation. Sad as it was, Nick was less believed than Sirius was in the settlement due to how unapproachable he was, as he rarely made public appearances beyond shows of power. Sirius, on the other hand, was an active participant in the community that was formed in the settlement and well known by everyone. With the man confirming what Nick said with his actions, everyone relaxed and a few of the braver folk even tried to pet Nazgul as well, if rather nervously. She just flopped down with a heavy thud. With the content expression at the attention. Seeing as he wasn't needed anymore, Nick went back to the island and Nazgul shrunk down and followed after once she was satisfied with the attention she received. At the same time, Hephaestus was finishing up her lesson and was ready to go back to the normal world. Nick thought nothing of it and let her out, but the moment he did so, the goddess noticed Nazgul and stiffened as a look of terror appeared on her face. She immediately hid behind Nick like he was able to protect her from anything that could legitimately threaten her. What is that thing?" she asked in panic while Nazgul just tilted her head at the goddess in confusion. Nick was equally confused about why the goddess was so afraid of Nazgul until he remembered what she said about the true nature of gods and how they were uniquely vulnerable to soul-based attacks after their bodies were killed. Nazgul was a perfect counter to gods, as she was able to bypass one's body and attack a soul directly, even to the extent of truly destroying it. In other words, Nazgul was the natural predator to the gods that had never known what that was like. One would think that meant she was a genuine threat to them at this moment, but that was not actually the case, as despite being a perfect counter, she was still only tier 4, much like Nick himself. Compared to a tier 7, she may as well be a bug with how easy any god could kill her at the moment, a fact the goddess seemed to not notice at the moment. "This is Nazgul, my familiar. She's quite friendly, I promise," Nick said reassuringly. The red-haired goddess relaxed minutely but was still highly vigilant against Nazgul, who got bored of the interaction and yawned before curling up to go to sleep. It was rather amusing to see the goddess be left speechless at the sheer lack of care given by the hyper-dangerous soul-devouring beast in front of her. Chapter 569, The Transition. It ended up taking a few days, but Hephaestus eventually got comfortable with Nazgul's presence. Nick had a sneaking suspicion that most of that time was merely a ploy at trying to get closer to him. The goddess was not subtle at all in what she wanted, even though she seemed to think he didn't notice. Nick chose to play dumb, however, like he was Ron levels of romantically dense, since he absolutely did not want to deal with the matter. He had far too much on his plate to even entertain the thought of romance with even a human, much less a literal goddess. Still, she was at least being vague enough that he could play it off easy enough. Honestly speaking, Nick could understand why she was trying to partner up with him, as on an existential level he was damn near perfectly attuned to her. Their personalities and domains just sort of clicked with each other, and to top it off, he was just as immortal as she was. In her own words, he was a god waiting to happen, as he was existentially on the same level but was merely 3 tiers of power lower, though that was soon to be only 2. Yes, with the world's mana levels now capable of supporting higher tiered beings, Nick had stopped restraining his mana's growth and was firmly pressing against the edge of tier 5, needing but a small push to advance. Hephaestus was a font of helpful information about this process, as she had the experience of witnessing a mortal become a god in the form of Asclepius. Tier 5 was the first step on this path, so it was obvious that only those truly talented or willing to sacrifice could succeed at becoming divine. Tier 5 was different than the first 4 tiers that were all about mana accumulation, as it was a qualitative leap forward, if a minor one. According to Hephaestus, one reached Tier 5 by firmly grasping the domains associated with them and infusing one's mana with them to cause a transition to begin. That was the essence of Tier 5, a transition period from mortal to divine. This infusion of domains was the reason why a god's energy, when not controlled, turned into whatever their domains were. For Hephaestus it became a metal that was in a malleable form for crafting. For Zeus it was a thunderous storm that crackled with lightning. Nick unfortunately had this distinct problem of possessing too many domains that needed to be infused equally into the tiniest part of his mana. Grasping one's domains was not an easy matter at all, as it was a bit like closing one's eyes to pinpoint the location of a sound. It took practice or a serious amount of luck just to grasp a single domain, but to get 8 and it was multiple times more difficult. Hephaestus even suggested that he discard a few of his domains to ease the difficulty, but the mere thought of relinquishing them at this step enraged him greatly. Relinquishing a domain was not as simple as merely choosing to keep it out of this process, but rather dropping all talent, accomplishments, and abilities related to it entirely. This meant for Nick that he had to give up a part of what made him, well, him. For those willing to give anything to reach divinity, it was a small price, but for Nick it would be catastrophic. Each of his domains were tied to each of the others in a delicate balance that if he dropped even a single one, his entire path up to now would be voided out almost entirely. He had worked far too hard and paid in blood, sweat, and tears to get where he is, and refused to be set back for a faster and smoother advancement. For someone born divine like Hephaestus, she couldn't understand what about it enraged him so much as grasping domains to be used was as easy as breathing for her. Nick explained it as a difference in starting points to her, where she began life far ahead of people like him and thus simply couldn't understand what it truly cost to get there from rock bottom. But for wizards like him it was a thing they were intimately familiar with and almost always proud of. To be told to discard all of one's effort and struggles to get to the next step was like insulting everything they had done to get there. Nick as a result stopped reading the lexicon with his second body and instead used the entirety of its attention to the task of grasping his domains, with very little to say for it after 2 weeks of time. Chapter 570, Origin Story. While his second body was working on that, Nick's main body was working with Hephaestus to upgrade the forging room to her standards, or at least as close as they could get. As she quickly learned, a vast majority of the resources that the gods had plentiful amounts of were in rare or non-existent supply at this point in time. She had even gone to check places that they had previously used for storing things, only to find out they had been raided or the things within had been ravaged by time and a lack of care in maintaining them. This didn't mean she came back totally empty-handed, however, as there were a few spots that she kept secret from even the other gods or were inherently hard to find without prior knowledge of the location. One such place was her personal armory, where she stored the things that she felt were too good for others or that she simply didn't want to hand over. She had been clever in her hiding place for the armory and placed it between moments in time at a very specific location. Specifically the split second between night and day at the heart of Mount Everest. She didn't intend to keep these weapons and powerful artifacts though, and used a spell that Nick wanted very badly because of how useful it would be. She simply called it Dismantle, which was a fitting name considering that it turned fully complete creations back into their base components without any loss at all. With this spell, Nick could finally upgrade his wand to be able to match him with all the ways to improve its original design that he had discovered until now. Daedric runes, organic smithing, starlight empowerment, and soul fueling. Hephaestus was more than happy to dismantle his wand, as well as she was quite curious to see him craft something, as this entire time she had not yet done so. Nick of course saved the feather within the wand before she dismantled the wand, as he didn't want to reset the progress the wand had made already. Instead, what he was doing was more akin to placing a core in a new housing than anything else, and the best part was that there was no margin of incompatibility between the old housing and the new one, as they were actually the same thing. All the runes and enchantments placed on the wand by Ollivander's ancestor vanished from the wood, and the wand itself was returned to being a branch of wood like it was before it had been carved into a wand. Nick was surprised to find that it was actually a very large and sturdy looking branch that could be used as a focus for magic. I see, it was a staff blank originally, but the ancestor wasted most of it to create a wand instead. Nick thought in understanding after seeing this. Where did you get this? Hephaestus asked seriously as she stared at the branch intensely. It was found in the tomb of an ancient wizard alongside a note that said man's first mistake. Why, do you recognize it? Nick asked curiously, as he had always been curious as to this piece of wood's true origin. How could I ever mistake the wood of that tree for anything else? Long ago, when Zeus and the rest of the gods broke free from their progenitor and slew or imprisoned the rest of the titans, they came together to create a single tree so that the world might be populated with lower species for them to rule over. The tree did not bear a name, as its creators never bothered to give it one, and it was from the tree that the first humans were born to resemble us gods. They, however, did not possess the gift of magic and could not, making them flawed things, which displeased Zeus greatly, as what was the point of ruling over a race that couldn't possibly understand the gap between them and himself. In his rage, Zeus commanded the first humans to destroy that which birthed them, and they obeyed. The tree had great power, however, and upon being felled unleashed a vicious power upon humanity to spite Zeus a final time, potential for divinity in a select few that was hidden due to needing a key ingredient to manifest. It needed a spark of divinity to be placed within the humans before it could appear. At the time no one knew of this, and when the gods led by Zeus began to mate with the humans, the offspring born were what you now know of as the first wizards. Humans born with the potential of the gods but flawed innately just as their progenitors. She spoke seriously. Chapter 571, New Focus. And what became of the wood that the tree was made of? Nick asked curiously. Zeus had the tree's wood burned in the flames of the realm of the dead so that it would draw the souls of the humans that died to that place. It is why I am surprised to see that a branch of it has survived to this time. Likely hidden by those first humans from Zeus, no doubt. She said honestly. So the first mistake of man was to be born flawed? Nick asked with a frown, as that was an odd way to think, to say the least. Perhaps it refers to the act of hiding the wood from Zeus instead? He is not one to take disobedience well. Hephaestus offered, and Nick felt that fit much better, but he couldn't say for sure what the true meaning was, as it was simply too vague. Still, the fact that the entire branch could be used as a focus near perfectly threw a wrench in Nick's plans, as he was just going to remake his wand originally, but that was rather wasteful compared to a staff like he could make now. The first step though is to strip off the unneeded parts like the bark and any hindering parts for magical flow. Nick said as he went to work. Hephaestus didn't say anything but watched intently as he carefully carved the blank into the correct form. The final shape was a 5-foot-long piece of wood that was mostly straight with a hollow space at the top like an eye socket. Nick then began to slowly infuse the wood itself with starlight material and the various improvers that he had. Then he split the staff open and began to carefully carve the Daedric runes into the wood that he found were perfect for wand making previously. He went even further than usual with this step, as he had more room to work with and so could add even more runes to the wood to improve it further. He hesitated to place the feather within the staff, however, as he felt it was not enough for it. In an epiphany moment he realized what it was he needed to add as well, a part of himself. From his head he plucked a single strand of his own hair and carefully entwined it around the feather before placing it within the staff and closing it up. Immediately the staff began to hum and glow as the core synced up with the wood, and Nick had a smile that grew wider and wider as he sensed the power of the staff before him. The final touch came as he infused the staff with a powerful soul that he had prepared beforehand by feeding a single fragment of his own soul that was barely more than a grain of sand compared to the entirety of his soul, many weaker souls to strengthen it. He of course fed that grain of his own soul pure soul energy rather than the actual souls, since he wanted it to remain in its proper shape. With this the bond with his wand/now staff was restored to its full might and even made much stronger, as the focus could now be considered a true part of his being. Nick had an idea after seeing the eye socket-like hole at the top of the staff and quickly moved to grab the Omni crystal he had never found a use for until now and carefully slotted it into the hole. To his amazement, the wood of the hole actually grew around and enclosed the crystal, as the crystal itself seemed to stop glowing and turn into a pure clear diamond atop the staff. Nick knew that it wasn't so simple, however, as he could quite literally feel the power rippling off the staff as it seemed to distort the free ambient mana in the air around it from its mere presence. Reaching out, the staff levitated off the workbench of its own accord and settled in his hand like a perfectly normal piece of wood without a hint of power leaking out of it. Staff, primordial wood / celestial bird feathers / Didra hair. Grade, Divine. Abilities, Avian Dominion, Unrivaled Transfiguration, Fire Affinity, Lightning Affinity, Water Affinity, Air Affinity, Soul Affinity, Creation Affinity, Bound, Nicholas Ravenclaw, Lordly Proof, Endless Growth. Mythical Ability, Daedric Might, summons a dreadful attack on the souls that dare try and steal this artifact. Legendary Ability, Lord's Decree, once a day the wielder of this artifact may decree something and at the cost of their own mana make it so. Divine Ability, Sagacity, passively empowers all magic cast through this artifact at no extra cost to its wielder. Chapter 572, Work and Adventurers. A Divine Weapon. I hadn't even thought a tier 4 capable of creating such a thing, yet there it is. Hephaestus said with clear awe as she examined the staff in Nick's hands closely. He also agreed with her as well, since he was fairly certain that many of the concepts that had been brought together to create this staff were beyond the reach that any tier 4 should possess normally. Even the ballad enchantments that he could use were not able to create a divine item at tier 4, as any normal one simply lacked the mastery and pure power required to do so. With the staff in hand, Nick could even feel his own domains much more clearly, and so he turned his hand and sent the staff to his realm so that his other body could accelerate the process of his transition to tier 5. After that, the two of them began to dismantle the artifacts that she brought with her for raw materials to upgrade the forge room to her standard. She was not the one who enchanted and created the equipment she previously used, but after having spent centuries working with the stuff, she had long since memorized the enchantments and material composition of the equipment. The furnace, for example, got entirely dismantled while preserving the flames he had for it, as a new one was created that was considerably more powerful and useful. The new one not only allowed the use of all those flames and more, but also allowed for the mixture of flames to empower one's craftsmanship even further. The engravers, molds, and various other pieces of equipment got the same treatment as they overhauled the entire workshop. The final result barely even resembled the room's previous design, which was a little off-putting for Nick, but he knew he would adapt quick enough. Good, now I can begin crafting again. The goddess said, pleased with the state of the area. Nick merely nodded and finally went back to work on the issues regarding the settlement he had been ignoring for a while, to focus on the stuff with her and upgrading his crafting equipment. It was mostly mundane stuff like civil disputes or loopholes found in his rules that people have found. Making rules that applied equally to muggles and wizards alike was more challenging than one would assume, as many things that would stop a muggle won't work on a wizard, and the reverse is also true in some cases. Still, as it was tedious but simple stuff like that, Nick caught up fairly quickly and was finally able to start working on the really important stuff like expanding his magical communication network, as well as claiming and fortifying more land around his area for farming and possible future city expansion. Sad as it was, most of the small towns and villages all over the world had been destroyed by this point in time, so there was a lot of room for expansion and reclamation. The first group of adventurers from the guild he created were also finally finished training and were ready to be sent out into the wilds to record and explore. So far they had only been doing the job of beast calling, so the new freedom to get out there and do new and interesting things was very tempting. These new adventurers were given a special card that Nick created that had a few functions. First was proof of identity, as each of them was bound to the soul of their owner, and thus the guild always knew when a person claiming to be an adventurer was who they said they were. The second was that the cards were connected to a matching one in the guild, so when the adventurer lost their lives the guild knew about it immediately. The final use of the cards, however, was a point of contention, as they also served as trackers so the guild could investigate the locations that the adventurers report on or die in. Some people liked the tracking feature and others abhorred it, so it had mixed reviews. But it was still accepted for the most part due to the fact that it was only ever used by guild personnel who were under contract not to share the information with others outside the circumstances that it was necessary. This meant using the tracking feature to get revenge or to stalk an adventurer simply couldn't happen. Nick made sure that not even legilimency could be used to accomplish such a thing, so anyone with that idea was in for a rude awakening. Chapter 573, Attack. About 3 days after the adventurers started to head out to explore and categorize the surrounding flora and fauna, Nick got a report that made him quite angry. The war bands that he had chased off previously had come back in even greater numbers. Not only that, but they had finally made it clear what it was that they wanted by capturing or killing most of the adventurers that had left the settlement's walls. They put forth demands of surrender and even asked for Nick's head in exchange for the hostages back. There was not a riot because of stupid people in the settlement, because anyone who thought that was a good idea was quickly convinced by the smart people living there that it was not in fact a good idea. Nick's anger caused his presence to crash down on his surrounds, which drew Hephaestus out of the workshop to check on him. I am sorry that my outburst disturbed you. I am merely angered by the audacity of these people despite my generosity. They made pests of themselves out of greed or ambition, and I mercifully chased them away without any injury at all. Now they have come back in greater numbers and not only killed or captured my subjects but even dared ask for my life to free those they took. Nick said angrily. He had tried to give these people a chance to turn themselves around or at the very least become someone else's problem, but instead they escalated the situation. You have done your duty as a good ruler and tried to limit the loss of life, but now it is time to take it instead. The goddess said coldly. Unlike Nick, she was a bit better at controlling her power, so despite her own anger at the audacity of these people, she did not affect her surrounds. Nick knew that her anger came from a place of closeness, as she had clearly grown attached to him, so the idea of someone wanting him dead upset her. I know, they will be dead by the end of the day. Nick spoke firmly as he stood up and his staff appeared in his hand while his armor assembled itself on his body. For a first-time warning such as this, a quick death will suffice. Celebrimbor said from the mindscape from experience. The Elf Lord was once a ruler himself, so he knew what to do in matters such as this. I will be killing them quickly anyways, but first I need to rescue the hostages. Nick thought, and the Elf Lord gave an approving nod. Flying out of the barrier around his island, Nick went straight to the settlement to find a few people for the next step. The hostages are likely being guarded heavily, so simply sneaking into the place they are being held was going to work. As a result, Nick planned to draw out all the people guarding the hostages as a distraction, while the team he was getting now grabbed the hostages and retreated. The team was going to consist of Sirius, the twins, and 3 muggles that had proven themselves excellent in combat. Sad as it was, those born with the talent to be warriors before the ritual reset everything simply couldn't excel at anything else and struggled in the world. Now, however, they could fully unleash their talents so long as they had the opportunity. Nick was more than happy to give them exactly that, with magical weapons and armors made to close the gap between the magical and mundane in terms of combat. Hunters they had been dubbed by those in the settlement who saw them training or fending off the occasional magical beast that got too close to the settlement. There were roughly 4 sorts of hunters from what Nick could see, not because that was all that could be, but by their own design. The first sort were the assassins that used short but fast weapons and stealth to try and finish their prey off quickly. The second were the juggernauts that focused their entire skill set on pure defense and as a result were slow and used heavy massive weapons for more damage if they hit, but were also less likely to actually land a blow. The third sort was the rangers that focused their entire skill set on long-range attacks via either magical guns or in a few rare cases bows. These ones were arguably the most dangerous, as if you weren't aware of them they could kill you without you ever seeing a single sign of them. The final sort were the death dealers, people that took parts from the other 3 and fused them into a combat style that could perform in every circumstance but were not as good at each part as those fully specialized in it. Chapter 574, Attack, 2. The 3 muggles that Nick was going to get along with the wizards were hunters that stood head and shoulders above the others in performance. Eustace Cormac, an assassin who used twin short swords with armor-piercing enchantments and chameleon enchanted light armor. Michael Smith, a juggernaut who wielded a massive hammer with a tremoring enchantment and wore a full set of thick plate armor with a gravity manipulation enchantment. Finally there was the odd one out of the hunters, Mary Ernest, who wielded an extremely narrow dagger and specialized in poisons that caused others to avoid her as much as possible. Nick kicked up a bit of dust when he landed in the area of the settlement that the hunters used to spar and train. He then called out the names of all 3 of these people and waited for them to come to him. The first to appear was Michael Smith, who despite looking like a walking tank and had a hammer whose head was as big as his torso on his back, didn't sink into the ground at all, like he weighed nothing at all. Next was Eustace Cormac, that tried to sneak up on Nick but was looked at casually by him, which made the man smile. Final came Mary Ernest, who walked out of the shadows nearby wearing a dark green set of robes that clinked ever so subtly from the many vials of poison strapped to the inside of it. I have a mission for you 3 in regards to the hostage situation we have. Nick said calmly without trying to hide his intentions here at all. Taking the 2 of us I can sort of understand, but why take him as well? No offense, Mike. Eustace questioned while referring to himself and Mary as those chosen for the mission. None taken. Michael said, not bothered at all at the doubt since he clearly shared it as well. It's because if things go bad he is able to escape while covering everyone else. Perhaps you haven't realized it, but thanks to the way he is using that gravity enchantment he can move freely and even probably swing that hammer as fast as your short sword. What do you think would happen if he were to switch his gravity to say 5 times more than normal mid-swing? Nick asked, and both Mary and Eustace got the point if the shudder that ran through them was any indication. Suppose I shouldn't be surprised you figured that out given what we know of you. Michael said with a shrug without denying it at all. Nick knew for a fact that that hammer under normal gravity was close to 500 pounds precisely, so multiply that by say 5 and you had a bit over a ton moving very fast. Needless to say, anything in that hammer's way was in for a very unpleasant time. Nick was quite happy with the idea as it held an incredible amount of potential and was the last thing you would want to face in close quarters. Moving on, the mission is fairly simple. You three along with 3 wizards are going to sneak into the area that the hostages are being held while I distract everyone else there. The guards will be distracted, so if you can silently kill them, do it, as it'll make it easier to extract the hostages. If you are uncomfortable killing humans, you can also knock them out or paralyze them. Once you free the hostages, send up a signal and I'll open up an escape route for you. Nick explained seriously. Why is the plan so simple? Michael asked, confused. Because complex plans almost never work out in the end. If there are no more questions, we still need to go get the 3 wizards that will be coming with you. Nick said, and after confirming that the 3 of them understood the mission, he turned and started heading to the Adventurers Guild to grab Sirius. The twins' shop was on the way, so he got them before they got to the guild. There were a few people at the guild asking about what was being done for the situation, but when Nick appeared with his group there was silence. We are mounting a rescue and retaliation mission to rescue those taken, so please God about your days and wait for the news of our return. Nick said simply but confidently. It didn't tell them much, but it was enough to soothe their nerves that something was being done to fix the issue. Once Sirius was added to the team, Nick went over the plan again and explained how they would be sneaking in as well as where the hostages were, thanks to him scrying them as well. Chapter 575, Attack, 3. The trick that the team would be using to sneak into the area that held the hostages was by broom under invisibility. It was disturbing how rarely people actually check above them for things, so flying silently over the camps and straight to the hostages was a genuinely good idea. The team of course brought extra brooms so that hostages could fly away as well, and waited high up when Nick took the lead to fly towards the war band's camps openly. An alarm went off when he was spotted, and it didn't take long for most of the people to gather up, with 3 people clearly leading them. So you came to give yourself up then? Why don't you come down here and let us take those wonderful things you have on you nice and easy? Unless you don't care about the hostages, that is. One of the leaders said. It was a grizzled-looking old wizard that Nick looked at in disgust with how filthy his soul was. Obviously it was a dark wizard that decided to live out his ambitions for conquest. You are mistaken about something. I am not here to surrender, but to stomp out a pest that doesn't appreciate the mercy I gave them last time. Nick said coldly. He then raised his staff and the space around the area was locked down, preventing any form of escape. Attack. Kill him quickly. The leaders commanded, and hundreds of spells and arrows shot into the sky at Nick, including many killing curses. He sneered at these attacks and pushed his staff forward. Give me your souls. He spoke coldly as he used one of the abilities of his staff. Immediately the very air shook as a wave of magical force erupted from the front of his staff towards the spot that many people were, including the leaders. The wave passed through all of them despite their shields and transfigurations to try and stop it, yet did not seem to do any damage. The people looked confused at first but began to laugh and mock him for failing to do any damage at all. Their own attacks were easily dodged by Nick as he coldly landed on the ground and held out a hand palm facing up. Silence came, however, as bright lights started to seep out of everyone who had been hit by his decree. As the lights fully left the people's bodies, they dropped to the ground instantly, dead. Panic overcame the masses as they tried everything they could to stop their souls from being ripped out of their bodies, whether that was counter curses or even trying to attack Nick. None of it would do them any good though, as once the price had been paid by Nick in mana, his decree was made law and there was nothing save a power on the same level that could stop it. The price to forcefully claim the souls of over 1,000 people was massive. Nick was pretty much a spent force after doing so. He played it off well though, as he sucked in copious amounts of mana with each breath to try and restore that which was lost, but it was slow going. As more and more people lost their souls, it grew progressively quieter until there was only the sound of the wind blowing and the horror of all those spared that fate having witnessed it. Some fell to their knees to beg forgiveness and others tried to flee, but the same result was achieved, death. Nick coldly used the least amount of magic he could to end the lives of each and every person present, regardless of if they surrendered or not. The team rescued the hostages during this chaos, and they all watched as Nick single-handedly passed judgment on the lives of those in the war bands. It was a shocking scene to watch, as though death personified had come to claim its due as Nick strolled forward in a calm, even pace, with each step meaning the end of one or more lives. Even worse was they could see the bright lights exiting the bodies as Nick extracted the souls casually as he went. This isn't a battle, it's a massacre." Sirius muttered, and none of those flying next to him could bring themselves to disagree. "Not even death saves them from him, what a monster!" someone said, and they all remained quiet, not able to deny it. By the end of the next hour, all that was left of the war bands that came here was a collection of dead bodies, empty tents, and ownerless equipment. Chapter 576, Governmental Collapse. Nick didn't spare the empty camps another glance and slowly flew up into the air before returning back to his island after seeing that the hostages were fine. He saw the looks that he was getting from the entire group and sighed in disappointment. They clearly didn't understand the purpose behind what he did and only saw it as an act of cruelty. The truth of the matter was that Nick took no pleasure from the act at all and only did what he believed to be necessary. Mercy is all well and good when those who get it appreciate what they were given, but people like those war bands needed to be cut down as soon as possible. Nick wasn't going to explain this to the group of witnesses though, as he felt it would be a waste of time since they had already made their own judgments on the matter. Those that knew the pain a repeated enemy could inflict like Sirius were clear about the necessity of wiping threats clean quickly, while the others were still stuck in the way the world used to work. Nick didn't blame them for it though, as it had only been about 4 months since the ritual. Speaking of that amount of time, the next school year of Hogwarts was coming up in the next week, and the Ministry was starting to become problematic in that regard. See, the Ministry had finally had enough about not really having a say in the way the school operated and was now trying to force itself into the place. They did this by trying to have Dumbledore expelled as headmaster so that they could take control of the school, but they were hit with harsh rejection the moment they tried. The old wizard didn't even need to personally act on the matter, as the vast majority of the Isle's wizarding community rebelled and began to flock out of the Ministry's area of control. For a governmental institution like the Ministry, this was a devastating blow, as without subjects no amount of new laws or procedures will accomplish anything at all. That rang the death knell of the Ministry, as once the rest of its employees realized that the organization had no future, they too began to defect. Both Nick's and Dumbledore's settlements suddenly grew massively from the influx of new people that divided themselves between both sides of the Isle. That was the funny part about the locations of both settlements on the Isles, as Hogwarts and thus Dumbledore's area was far to the north in the Scottish Highlands. Nick's island and settlement, however, was far to the south near the bottom of the Isle, in fact, so you could split the Isle in the middle and both sides would have an equal amount of land to work with. You might assume that gaining so many new subjects from various backgrounds helped fill in the gaps that both settlements had, but you would be mistaken. While it was true that some gaps were filled, the fact was that some problems grew even greater in size as well. For example, food and shelter was now a very serious problem for both settlements, as neither had expected to suddenly have thousands more mouths to feed and house. This didn't even include the nightmare that was the amount of deaths caused by these people braving the wilderness to migrate to the settlements. Nick was powerful and skilled, but even he had limits to the amount of work he could handle at once without trading away his own personal growth in exchange. Regrettably, Nick was forced to install an actual governmental system for his now city-state to take a huge portion of work away from him and distribute it amongst different people. Sirius, as the Adventurers Guild Master, was now in charge of the public governmental aspects of that which he complained about a lot. Percy was placed in charge of the economics, as he was a stickler for order and hard work, so he wasn't one to slack off. A couple of muggles had governmental positions as well that covered the food and miscellaneous parts that popped up. Nick, of course, was the head of this government, but he didn't have absolute authority anymore, which freed up a considerable amount of his time. Thanks to most problems no longer requiring him to spend time thinking about and implementing solutions for them, he was able to focus both of his body's time on grasping his domains rather than having one constantly working on the settlement. He also vastly accelerated the speed of his communication tower's construction and implementation. At the end of September, Nick's communication bracelets had a range covering about a quarter of the entire Isle, and it was still expanding. Chapter 577, Daedra. To be more accurate, Nick had created an almost straight line of signal towers from his territory all the way to Hogwarts so that he could finally have a fast method to communicate with Dumbledore. Sending letters was fine before, but it took too long normally, as even an emergency owl took several hours to arrive from only half the Isle away, much less the whole thing. In that amount of time, whatever the issue was might have already been solved and thus no long need to request aid. This new method, however, was considerably faster, as there was only at most a few minutes delay from the time the message was sent to when it was received from the other side of the Isle. It wasn't as fast as phones or anything like that, but it was still leagues better than using owls to send letters. There had also been a change in the realm that Nick hadn't expected so soon, but was a welcome thing in the form of a soul forming in the waters of the realm. The first true Daedra to be born into this world, and it was an interesting one. The creature was of the beastly sort of Daedra rather than the humanoid kind, but looked nothing like any Daedra he had ever read about. It had a narrow serpentine body that had feathers instead of scales and 6 stumpy but strong-looking legs to carry it. The head was that of an eagle's but had a black jagged beak and a single spiraling horn atop it. The long tail of the Daedra was also like that of a manticore or scorpion and curled behind it. The entire creature was a dull red color and definitely not pleasant to look at. Nick couldn't really complain though, as all Daedric creatures tended to have malicious appearances regardless of which realm they hail from. After wading out of the realm's waters, the creature absent-mindedly walked about without any real purpose at all. To be expected, I suppose, since it is the first of its kind and lacks any outside stimulus. Nick thought as he watched the creature for a while. After growing bored of watching it behave in a pointless manner, Nick introduced a variable to test the creature's reaction in the form of a transfigured pig from the ground itself. There was an immediate response as the creature directly and viciously attacked the transfiguration, stabbing it with its tail and ripping open its belly with its beak. After the transfiguration ended, the creature got angry at the disappearance of its prey and started to attack its surroundings in a reckless manner. This thing definitely fits the Daedric way of doing things all right, so violent and easily angered. Nick thought in amusement before having his other body appear before the creature to see how it would react. The creature froze the moment Nick arrived in front of it and even directly cowered in submission. To be expected, even for a new Daedra like yourself. Hierarchy is ingrained in your very essence. You may leave. Nick spoke calmly and dismissed the creature that hurriedly scurried away, instinctively understanding what he had said. All Daedra, even the beasts like that one, were fairly intelligent, so Nick wasn't surprised that it obeyed his command. As far as that Daedra was concerned, he was a god and should not be disobeyed. Looking over at the waters of his realm, Nick wondered when a true Dremora would be born so he could see what to expect of most of the rest. It was a matter of chance really, so there was honestly no way to know for sure until it happened. A bit of a misunderstanding that many in Nirn had was that the waters of Oblivion were constantly churning out new Daedra at all times, but the truth was that most of those were the same Daedra having needed to reconstitute themselves after getting killed. True new Daedra were actually very rare, and one would be lucky to witness a single such event in a decade years. It could be sooner or later depending on how often the waters had the older Daedra reconstitute themselves in it though. For his own realm, Nick was pretty sure he could expect at least one new Daedra every few months or so now that his realm had crossed the threshold to be able to spawn them. With that bit of excitement over with, Nick went back to grasping his domains while mostly leaving the little Daedra to its own devices. It had tried to attack the golden apple tree after discovering it, but after Nick exploded the violent thing as a punishment, it avoided that spot in the realm with extreme prejudice. Chapter 578, Style Teaching. What a fascinating crafting style. I have never even thought of something like it. Hephaestus gushed over the golden ring sitting on the anvil that Nick had just created in front of her. It had been a week since the Daedra was born, and Nick decided he should stop putting off showing the goddess his crafting styles. It had become glaringly obvious that she was probably going to be a part of his life for a long time, so his secrets would get out to her eventually anyways. Rather than deal with her bugging him all the time to figure out what he did and how, Nick chose to just directly show her so that he could relax and craft in peace. This brings us back to the current moment when he was showing her the first crafting style he had, the Celebrumber style. Technically the style could be renamed, since according to the elf lord himself Nick had already transformed it from what it once was, so it can't even be considered the same thing anymore. Nick refused to do so however, as he firmly believed that the original name the style got stayed the name of it regardless of what it turned into, so the original name stuck even now. Anyway, the goddess was absolutely enthralled by the style, even though there was much to it that Nick hadn't shown her yet. I am not surprised, since from what I understand spiritual magics are heavily underutilized, and that fact held true in your era as well. He said calmly. Most of us thought that souls were too dangerous to tamper with and thus ignored the field. Hades was the only one who thought otherwise, but many just assumed that was because it had to do with his domains. Hephaestus said honestly. That same thought process is held to this day for the most part as well, so in quite a few ways I can be considered a pioneer in the field, as even now I am still learning new things about souls. For example, the 1,000+ souls I took from that war band had a few that actually resisted my power without any clear reason why. Nick said with a smile. Truly? She asked, surprised, and he nodded. Perhaps souls do merit research for applications in crafting. She muttered with a bright look, as if she had suddenly found some form of enlightenment. The approach that was taken to create the base of this style was the innate power of and connection to magic that all souls have. By projecting one's knowledge via their spiritual energy, one can create a sort of imprint that binds and flows fully throughout an object, thus creating an enchantment that mimics the effects of the knowledge chosen. Nick explained, and Hephaestus looked thoughtful for a moment before holding up a finger that glowed a powerful red and gold color, and Nick felt the weight of her own soul pressing down on his body, making him horribly uncomfortable. She then pressed her finger onto the ring on the anvil, and Nick threw up a shield immediately to cover them as the ring exploded from conflicting energies and the overloading of them. Hephaestus frowned at this. Why did it detonate? She asked, confused since she followed what he said to the letter. I should have explained a few rules that need to be understood first. To be fair, I wasn't expecting you to figure out the basics after a simple explanation though, Nick said with a sigh. He then explained the rules that came with the crafting style, such as finished enchantments being unable to be added to, as well as how the enchantment has to be eased into the item rather than shoved in all at once, as it will damage the item or outright destroy it if it wasn't strong enough. There were a few more rules as well that he explained that had to do with the organic material enchantments, as well as the few things he has discovered about the style outside of crafting, like the soul sense. Hephaestus was a stupid fast learner, which Nick wasn't sure was because she was a god or not, but allowed her to grasp the foundation of the style within a mere couple of hours. After that he showed her the more advanced techniques like the body dispersal forging technique and the enchantment chains that strung multiple things together into a single complex enchantment. She ended up surprising him with a sneaky peck on the cheek after he got done teaching her the parts he could. That simple action left his mind in chaos for the rest of the day, much to her amusement. Chapter 579, Style Teaching, 2. Nick was aware of her fondness for him and admittedly also felt a little bit the same, even if he tried quite hard to prevent such a thing. Getting attached when a foe like Zeus lurked around the corner was ill-advised to say the least, but some things were outside of one's ability to control. Ignoring the troublesome emotions he was developing, Nick had chosen to start the goddess on the Celebrimber style rather than the Twilight style like Lucas, because unlike his assistant she definitely had the control needed to safely pick up the art. Lucas instead was admittedly quite mediocre in terms of magical and crafting talent, so if he was human Nick wouldn't even bother teaching the man, as he would die of old age long before getting to an acceptable level. As a vampire, however, Lucas's talent could be made up for with sheer devotion over time to learning and improving as he no longer aged. This was why Lucas had been taught the basics all metal workers should know before being taught the Twilight styles, so that his magical control could reach the level of learning the Celebrimber style. Nick's system was a bit unfair in this regard, as it directly ignored the prerequisites to learning a crafting style and gave him full understanding of the styles he obtained from it based on the creator's will. Even then, every style upon acquisition could be considered complete even if there was much room for improvement, like in the Twilight style. Nick hadn't forgotten that he still possessed a crafting style ticket that would let him gain a new crafting style if he wanted to, but like when he first got it, he wanted to reach a point with the Twilight style that he ran out of ideas for improvements before he got a new style. Hephaestus was surprisingly frugal with her use of materials as she experimented with the new style she learned, as she tended to recycle the materials after she completed a work, even if Nick found the loss of the items painful to witness. The reason for that was simply because nothing she made was ever below mythical grade, and she had even discovered that the Celebrimber style's limit was legendary, as no matter how complex she made the enchantments, the power never went beyond tier 5. She postulated that the growth type enchantments using the style might be the only exceptions to this rule, however. Nick had not been surprised by this discovery, as he had assumed that something of the sort was the case, but he had been unable to verify it, as tier 5 was his limit for power to begin with. The same was obviously not the case for Hephaestus, since she was a tier 7 existence and thus had a limit at or even above that level. The person who did take the discovery harshly, however, was Celebrimber himself, as the Elf Lord had always assumed that since he himself first learnt the basics of it from Sauron, who was a Maya, that the limit was at least at that level. Maya were basically gods, however, and also knew that the world was unable to handle such a level of power and thus limited the amount of power to ever appear on the world. Even the evil ones like Sauron and Morgoth limited their power massively when they walked the world. Considering this, it was actually impressive enough that the style could even reach the transition point to divinity. 2 days after teaching Hephaestus the style, however, Nick noticed something surprising: she had grown more powerful. It was a small increase, but an increase nonetheless. "You have grown stronger in such a short period," Nick stated in confusion after watching her craft a beautiful dagger with the Celebrimber style that could directly kill even Dumbledore like he was an ant. The reason for this was because the enchantment was designed in such a way as to pierce all defensive magics below tier 5 and only meet resistance upon encountering flesh. Basically, whoever had this dagger could stroll up to the old man and stab him in the heart without any issues at all, regardless of what passive defenses the old man had on him. Yes, after transitioning towards the divine, the method to grow one's power has less to do with one's mana quantity but rather the quality instead. In the case of tier 7s like myself, we improve our power by refining our domains with aspects of other domains, in this case the soul domain. She explained with a small smile. "I see, that would explain why none of you gods ever reached tier 8, as you rarely interacted with other domains on purpose," Nick said, and she nodded in agreement. Chapter 580, Style Teaching, 3. "In that case, my next style should prove extremely beneficial for you, as it falls within 3 domains that you don't have personally," Nick added, and Hephaestus perked up with a look of interest. Which domains? She asked curiously. Light, stars, and magic. The last one you definitely have aspects of in your work, but perhaps not these same aspects. Nick explained honestly. She seemed to fall in thought at this information and frowned before explaining that she couldn't think of a way to craft with those domains. You cannot be blamed for that, as it takes a very unorthodox approach to them to reach the style's foundational principles. Nick said reassuringly. He then explained how the style worked and even showed her a few examples of the light material that he had in stock. I had been wondering about this stuff, as it was unlike any material I had ever seen. Thea would be gravely offended should she have been alive to witness this material that was so closely tied to her domains and yet far from them as well. Hephaestus said with a smug look. Nick could understand as well, since according to the myths that remained from Hephaestus' era, she was basically a tool or bullied individual by nearly the entirety of the pantheon. If someone wanted something crafted, then she was all but forced to do so, and every recorded case of rebellion led to harsh punishment. As a result, it was only natural that she likely took great joy in spitting on the things those same gods held dear or were proud of. The basis of this style is that each star is a source of magic, and that if their light was condensed into physical form, one could create items with those same types of magic. I will admit, however, that I am still improving this style as I go. Nick said calmly. He then went on to show her the ropes in drawing the light, as well as all the ways he had improved the style over time, and even mentioned his ideas on how he might improve it in the future. She listened with rapt attention and even asked questions that Nick was sometimes unable to answer, as he himself didn't know. Surprisingly, she learned this style much slower than she did the Celebrumber style, and had barely gotten past the first step by the end of the day. When asked about it, she explained that while this was indeed a crafting style, it was so loosely attached to that domain that she was way out of her comfort zone as she learned it. She continued by explaining that the style was borderline purely light and star domain based, with the tiniest smidge of crafting involved. Despite her difficulty learning it, she was very eager to thank him for teaching it to her, as according to her it would greatly increase her power, like she had added a whole new domain to her divinity rather than a single aspect of it. It wasn't all good times, however, as Nick now realized just how tall an order reaching Tier 5 was for him, as all 8 of his domains were tied to 2 main ones, creation and magic. As a result, his domains were ridiculously complex for his tier, and thus very hard to grasp and use to transition towards divinity with. This did not discourage Nick, however, as he knew that what was usually hard to accomplish was also usually the most rewarding as well. Over the next 2 weeks, Hephaestus got better and better at using the Twilight style, and had even begun to try and implement Nick's ideas for improvement, with mixed results as she used her own knowledge for it. For example, she had successfully figured out how to fuse 2 types of light materials together based on a rule she discovered. The rule in this case was that the color of the stars that the light came from needed to be the same, or at least very similar, for the materials to have a possibility of combining. For example, the light material from 2 separate blue stars had the potential to fuse even if their properties were nothing alike. This rule's discovery was huge for Nick, as it broadened the potential of the style's enchantments drastically, as the 2 fused materials bore entirely new properties, or even both of the previous ones. Using this fact, Nick fused the materials from the sun and another yellow star to create a material that held both evil-destroying and nourishing properties that he fused into his realm's star to try and bring it closer to the full power of the sun. Chapter 581, Age Issue. Nick wanted his star to get as close to the original in the real world, so that when he eventually absorbed the Earth into his realm, no one would notice the difference between the two. Speaking of the realm, Nick had started expanding the size of it greatly by absorbing the free-floating material around the Earth into it. Anyone familiar with the orbiting objects would be horrified to discover that they were half gone by this point, but they were a worthy sacrifice, as now Nick's realm's planet was nearly 100 kilometers in diameter. That was the size of a decently sized island's worth of distance from one point to the other in a straight line. Nick's own mana capacity had broken the limit of Tier 4 as a result, but he was not there yet, which created a strange sort of unbalance in him. He wasn't in danger because of it, but he felt bloated almost. Helplessly, he could only stop absorbing things into his realm in bulk and focus on having his tier catch up to his mana level. He wasn't having the best time of it, however, as he had only vague feelings in regards to his domains at this point. It was fast as far as Hephaestus was concerned, but for Nick it wasn't fast enough, as Zeus's return drew ever closer, and Nick had hoped to be at least Tier 6 by the time it arrived. Obviously, Nick was now clear that that was an unreasonable goal, and instead set his short-term goal on reaching the peak of Tier 5 instead. This was still ambitious and unlikely, but it was far more likely to be done by the time Zeus returned. The biggest headache about Zeus, though, was the god's rapist tendencies that almost always ended in pregnancy. While this would likely inject potent talents into the world and even potentially new gods in enough time, it also almost guaranteed that some of them will side with their father regardless of the way they came about. One only had to look at the records of Zeus's children as a whole to realize that they were generally speaking not the best of people. Insanity was a common theme for them to follow. For example, Nick was not looking forward to having to deal with these demigods in the future after they grew up at all. He couldn't even kill them early either, as until they grow up enough to understand right from wrong they were innocent, and Nick avoided killing such things as much as possible. It was the argument about killing a baby Hitler just reskined for a different individual. Shaking his head to remove these troublesome thoughts, Nick focused on the foggy wisps of his domain that existed within his own mana. They were like the different wavelengths of light within the mana, and he had to diffuse them in order to fully grasp them before converting a portion of his mana into them. This was a deeply personal matter, so Hephaestus could do nothing to help him besides cheer for him. She did this with random hugs and the occasional sneaky peck on the cheek when she thought she could get away with it. As much as he tried to ignore it, these acts of affection were pleasant and left him in a generally better mood than normally. The goddess knew her limits though, and didn't press the matter further than that, or even ask him to make it official in some regard. In an interesting twist, Lupin and Helena had made their own relationship public and even jointly taught defense against the dark arts now. They were engaged and set to wed in 4 months, which came with heavily mixed views. More than a few people found it disgusting that a ghost and a mortal would get romantically involved in each other, while there were also arguments about the age factor. Nick scoffed at those, as wizards easily lived hundreds of years if they were lucky, so once they hit at least an appropriate age for sexual activities such as 15 or 16, the rest of the time difference became irrelevant. Obviously that was different in the case of muggles that at most got a century to live unless a wizard unnaturally lengthened their lives. For muggles, getting involved with someone so much younger and shorter lived than yourself was cruel to both parties. In the end you would always be left with the pain of their passing and the knowledge that their entire life was little more than a blink of an eye to your own. That doesn't even consider how a muggle might be affected by their own body withering and decaying while you remained the same for the most part. Chapter 582, Visitor. This wasn't referring to their physical state but rather their mental one, as save for very specific cases most muggles would grow bitter and angry about it as time went on. The really cruel part with Helena and Lupin's situation though was that unless Lupin becomes a ghost himself, he too will have a similar experience. Nick wasn't sure if Helena had thought about this before shacking up with the man, but either way they would find out in time. Another interesting piece of news was that the merfolk had evolved after the ritual without anyone knowing and had shown themselves again in a less than pleasant manner. The ones in the Black Lake were still as peaceful as usual, but those that lived at sea had rebelled against wizarding oppression with a vengeance. As a collective their power had skyrocketed, and after learning about it Nick was pretty sure that it was the seal they had in their bloodline being released. He wasn't sure though, so he took a trip to the Black Lake to confirm his suspicions. What he found was that not only was he correct, but he had also greatly underestimated how badly the seal was suppressing their power. Tier 2 was where they were forcefully stuck at before, but as a collective they had all advanced 2 tiers straight to 4 without any exceptions at all by this point. Thankfully they only knew water manipulation magic, so they weren't as dangerous as a tier 4 wizard unless a group of them attacked you. With that out of the way, Nick went back to running his settlement while pushing for tier 5 when a visitor came to see him. If his senses didn't say otherwise, Nick could have almost swore that he didn't know the person sitting across from him. "Is this what you actually look like, or a disguise?" Nick asked the tall lean man with long brown hair and a calm gentle smile. "The stone extends my wife and I's life via pure life force, so when not suffering mana deficiency we are naturally at our peaks in appearance," Flammel said casually. "I see. I take it that the situation is relatively stable on your side of the pond. If you have the time to come see me then?" Nick asked after accepting the alchemist's answer. "We still have a few problems, but for the most part things have calmed down. That is one of the reasons I am here, in fact. Unlike your own ministry, the French ministry did not implode with this new world order, and so I have been sent as an ambassador to the 2 sovereigns of the Isles, which of course refers to you and Albus," Flammel said with a chuckle. Nick shrugged. Dumbledore was already posed to take charge once the ritual was completed, but it was quite a surprise when people flocked to me for shelter instead, he said honestly. This was true, as even before the world got reset Nick pretty much minded his own business and never reached for more political power in an active manner. Even his dealings with the vampires wasn't for political power, but rather because both sides had something the other wanted and so decided to ally. The political power that came with that was entirely just a side effect of this alliance and was promptly forgotten by Nick. In no way did he ever say that he was seeking to rule over the masses or anything like that, yet people sought him out for shelter nonetheless, so he stepped up to the challenge. "I know, but I must say you have done remarkable well for not wanting the position. In fact, in my own country many consider both you and Albus the kings of this land now. Speaking of, I was instructed to ask about the marvelous communication network you have set up and if you intend to share it with the rest of the world," Flammel said with an approving look. I don't mind sharing it, but as it stands right now there is not much point as the range of each tower is frankly abysmal. It might help a bit to have, but it is not strictly speaking necessary since the owl system still functions well enough. Nick said honestly. That is true, but it is actually the Muggle side of things that want it the most. They seem to hope that they can go back to the way things used to be before the ritual, but we both know that to be a foolish idea. Flamel said with a scoff. Nick nodded. I can't even begin to tell you how many of the Muggles here in the Isles alone have sent me requests to create a magical variant of a car. The only known example of such a thing I have ever seen failed shortly after the mana surged to its current levels. Nick said with clear irritation. Chapter 583, Visitor, 2. Ah yes, the Weasley car, fascinating thing really, but was horribly misenchanted. Flamel said with a nod. What would you expect from someone's casual pet project that they tried to stuff as many enchantments as possible in? Arthur Weasley never intended to make a functioning magical car to begin with, but rather sought to satisfy his own curiosity with the thing. Nick said with chuckle. The core mechanics of the car was no different from any other, but had enchantments layered on its frame and body, which meant that after the mana surged most of the mechanical parts simply stopped working. The car became decoration for the most part, as it simply couldn't function anymore. While it's true that I could make a form of magical transportation similar to a car, why would I? What would be the point of me doing such a thing? Any beast could peel it apart like a clam to get the tasty snacks within, which in turn wastes the materials and time needed to make the thing to begin with. The fact is, Muggles can thrive just fine without all the things that made their lives easier from before the ritual. Nick said seriously. Flamel nodded in agreement. You'll get no argument from me. I have seen them thrive without the stuff personally after all. Though helping replace the medical equipment they lost would be for the best to keep them healthy in the long run. He said helpfully. He had a good point, and Nick could somewhat agree that the hit to the medical advancement of the Muggles was going to drastically lower their lifespans if it wasn't fixed to a degree. Some things weren't needed since the wizarding world had long since figured out how to treat and cure most forms of illness, but other things like cheap painkillers and a few choice illnesses were still troublesome. Dragonpox, for example, had a cure but still hadn't been eradicated quite yet and was especially dangerous for Muggles. There were a few others, but the main thing to consider was all the super-boosted viruses and magical afflictions that will be popping up that wouldn't have a cure. I will have to consider looking into that, but for now I am focusing on trying to reach Tier 5 to prepare for what is to come. Nick said honestly. Albus did mention that you said an enemy of great power would be coming eventually, but he was unaware of the nature of this foe. I had assumed that you have solved that problem already after sensing the being you are housing upon my arrival. It appears I was mistaken, however. Flamel said seriously. That, Nick said, motioning to where Hephaestus was eavesdropping from, is Hephaestus, and yes, I do in fact mean that Hephaestus. The enemy coming is none other than Zeus himself, so as you may understand we are not ready for him at all. You and your wife are likely to be the most in danger upon his arrival, as he will no doubt try and bring the most powerful on the planet under him, with perhaps the exception of myself, who he will almost definitely try and kill. Nick said honestly. Flamel looked reluctant to believe him, which was totally fair given the nature of the information itself. You will forgive me if I find it hard to accept that not only were the gods real, but even that one of them is living with you. This being certainly feels powerful but not divine by any means. The old alchemist said seriously. That is because she is suppressing her presence in order to not disturb the work here within this manner. I can ask her to stop if you would prefer. Nick offered, and Flamel slowly nodded. You can stop eavesdropping on a conversation that you can't understand and come in, you know. Nick spoke to the goddess, who entered the room moments later with an embarrassed look. I was under the impression that Hephaestus was a male deity. Flamel said questioningly. That was Zeus's doing, actually. Something about feeling like fate was cheating him, since the metal and creation domains were considered male in nature, yet obviously she is not. Nick said with a shrug. Turning to the goddess, Nick spoke again. My friend here didn't believe me when I told him who you were. Could you be a dear and let him experience your full power? A short moment ought to do. Nick requested, and she nodded before a vast and oppressive feeling fell over the entire island and beyond for an instant before vanishing just as quickly. That should serve as sufficient proof of my claims, no? Nick asked with a smirk as Flamel looked horrified at Hephaestus. 14. Chapter 584, Visitor, 3. Flamel took a few moments to calm down, and even then he looked at Hephaestus warily. To be fair, she really did seem harmless most of the time, so it could be quite the shock to feel that the exact opposite was the case. While I am not entirely certain as to the difference in power between them, I imagine Zeus is even more powerful than she is, though that may change in time. Nick said, getting back on topic. How exactly do you intend to face such a foe, because from my perspective even I would be helpless in the face of such power? Flamel asked with a concerned look. I will be stalling for time, of course. Unless I am so unlucky as to be the first person that Zeus comes to after restoring his previous power, I will be warned and have time to hide myself away so I can accumulate power. It is admittedly a pathetic plan, but in this regard I am helpless, as the gap in our power is simply too vast at the moment. You and your wife should also attempt to reach tier 6 during this time, as I imagine you have converted most of your mana to your domains, correct? Nick asked after explaining his plan. We have indeed done so after the world became as it is now. For us, I imagine it was easier than normal, as we have had centuries to accumulate knowledge and mastery over our domains, which sped up the conversion greatly. Flamel admitted freely. Nick nodded in understanding, as it made sense considering how the process worked. In a manner of speaking, the Flamels were overqualified to be tier 5, so naturally when the mana levels reached a point capable of sustaining them, their growth towards tier 6 could be considered meteorically fast. Nick wasn't quite sure what the difference between tiers 5 and 6 were, as Hephaestus said that he would naturally come to know that when he reached tier 6 in a vague manner. He wasn't sure if she was messing with him or legitimately couldn't explain it for some reason, but he didn't press the matter as he still wasn't even tier 5 yet. If you do get to tier 6 before Zeus returns, you should be able to escape from him at that point, though I am not entirely certain on that. Nick said seriously. That is reassuring to hear, though I am curious as to how exactly you came to house a goddess to begin with. The old alchemist said curiously. Nick told him about the Slytherin library and the strange metal golems that the founder encountered and then sealed off in Iceland. He also told him about the ancient ruin and the seal that Hephaestus was in that had a tier 5 dragon guarding it. Nick of course made sure to leave out the fact that the ruin didn't belong to a human, or that the dragon was actually a Dwemer who miscalculated something when fusing their essence with an unborn dragon's and got consumed by it rather than being the one consuming. Speaking of that dragon, Nick had moved it to the lava area that the rest of its kind had been relocated to shortly before the ritual was completed. This had resulted in the creature being uncomfortable for a few days due to the lack of mana, but otherwise nearly unaffected. The reason for this was simply because Nick was afraid that the dragon would be killed by the god in the seal after they woke up. After actually coming to know Hephaestus, though, he had to admit that this was pretty far from the truth, as she would likely feel bad about taking the energy back after she woke up, since the dragon had clearly evolved to live in that molten metal. Not bad enough to refuse to do so, but at least bad enough that she would spare the thing even if it attacked her. This language is strange. Hephaestus interrupted the explanation to say in the French that Nick was speaking. Did you just reverse engineer a language by listening to our conversation? Flamel asked, flabbergasted. She probably did, considering she went through my entire library in a few days despite almost none of it being in her language. Nick said, not surprised at all. It was annoying to break down each word and recognize the root of it before moving forward from there. The goddess said honestly in response to the old alchemist's question. I am humbled by your speed, as it takes me many months and even years to accomplish a similar feat. Flamel said honestly. Chapter 585, Tier 5. Your mind will grow much more efficient after reaching tier 6, so what I did is not considered impressive by most standards. The goddess said with a shake of her head to disagree with the alchemist's praise. Ah, I see, at least I now have something to look forward to when I reach that point. Flamel said, showcasing his adaptability to a rapidly changing scenario. The man went on to ask Hephaestus a great many questions to sate his curiosity before finally leaving. She humored him, as she could tell that Nick held a great deal of respect for him but otherwise didn't really care for the interaction. Time passed after that, and soon 2 months came and went, with a few things happening in between them. The first was that Harry and Ginny officially started dating, which everyone who knew them thought it was about time. After the ball last year, those two had been awkwardly dancing about the topic, unwilling to be the first to make a move on the other. Another thing that happened was that a civil war had broken out between the Muggles and Wizards of America after the tension between both sides was finally ignited after the Muggle hate group known as the Ku Klux Klan killed a group of Medi witches that came to a town to render aid. This resulted in fierce retaliation from the Wizards against those responsible, and eventually this matter spilled out, with the truth being ignored as the people in the country took a them or us mentality. The ugliness of humanity showed its fangs in this matter, as even without guns and bombs things got brutal, with the Muggles going as far as killing innocent children via the old methods that the witch hunters used long ago. The population of obscurials, which had been almost entirely abolished thanks to the isolationist actions of the American ministry, exploded. This only made things worse, unfortunately, as now there was Muggle propaganda using the destruction that the unleashed obscuruses caused as evidence of Wizards' evil natures. Nick and Dumbledore both sent aid to the American Wizards, but it proved to only barely improve the situation. Another thing that had occurred during this time was that Dumbledore finally took the step into the animagus ritual to become a phoenix. Then he immediately underwent nirvana, as his new form was that of an old bird. Thankfully the old wizard had survived the process and been reborn from his own ashes and was now back to the prime of his life, but hadn't lost any of his previous skill or power at all. Few noticed it, but his mind was not as sharp as it was when he was younger, but after his rebirth his mind was crystal clear and the difference was night and day. Ironically, Dumbledore had also been stopped from entering Tier 5 himself because of his rebirth, adding a new domain to him, life. The man didn't complain about it though, as he actually considered it a blessing instead, as life and death magics were horribly difficult to grasp without an affinity for them, which he now had. One might consider life magic to be the same as medical magic, but that was quite far from the truth. While healing was a property of life magic, it was only a small part of it, much like living itself. Healing, aging, growth, wisdom and experience were all concepts held within the domain of life, making it a deep and broad topic. Nick himself likely would have gained the domain had he not cast off his mortality before undergoing the animagus ritual. Still, Dumbledore returning to his prime was a widely celebrated subject in the Isles amongst the wizards there, and even the muggles who needed to be filled in on why it was such a big deal got in on it. There was a slight problem in the form of the magical beast version of the ritual now being made public knowledge, as Dumbledore needed to explain how he suddenly got decades younger. The man of course asked Nick for permission first, as per the deal they made so long ago. Finally, at the end of November, Nick managed to cross over into Tier 5 himself. It had taken him quite the effort, but he had finally transformed the tiniest grain of his mana into his domain's energy and stepped forward into Tier 5. The process became mostly automated after that, as more and more of his mana got corrupted by the part that had been converted. The single grain became 2 and that 2 became 4 and so on at a steady rate as more and more of his mana began to get transformed. 21. Chapter 586, Deific Appearance. Nick found it odd how mundane the difference between Tier 4 and 5 was after reaching the later. He had expected some massive change in ability or something like that, but it simply didn't happen. He no longer felt imbalanced from having too much mana, but otherwise felt the same as before he started the transition. Hephaestus laughed at him when he asked her about it and explained that it was called a transition period for a reason. The changes didn't just immediately pop up like a video game character leveling up, but rather slowing began to manifest the further the process went. Nick understood, but was still left feeling a little ripped off, as he had been expecting instant gains like when he reached Tier 4. Ah well, at least I can get back to memorizing the knowledge held in the lexicon finally, he thought as he retrieved the staff from his other body in the realm. His main body would see more use out of it anyways now that he didn't need to focus on grasping his domains anymore. In a manner of speaking, the staff was an extension of his very being and as such could be considered a separate body of his, even if that wasn't actually true. While his body in the realm focused on the lexicon, Nick's main body went back to collecting the orbiting materials around the earth again and feeding them into his realm, which in turn grew his power further. After another month of this status quo, a major change came to the world as Hestia showed herself in America, as she forcefully put a stop to the war there and took over the whole area. Apparently she had sealed herself there alongside her eternal flame in what became known as Yellowstone National Park. There had been a battle between the Muggles and Wizards there right as she awoke due to some resource they both wanted or something like that, and so she captured both sides and used them to learn English before getting a rough history lesson from both sides. She was pissed after learning about how the war got started and directly exerted her unstoppable power to bring both sides to heel under her. Oh yeah, she's definitely Zeus's sister all right. Nick thought after hearing how she took over all of North America by force. While from a mythology standpoint Hestia's role was to tend the hearth of Olympus on Zeus's orders, Hephaestus told a different tale. Hestia was the oldest of the gods and one of the strongest, in fact, as her domains were sacrifice, fire and home or hearth. Hestia was the only god who willingly gave up on nearly all worldly pleasures as a sacrifice to her domains. This sacrifice was so grand that even before the fall of the world, because of the other gods' actions, she was 1 foot into Tier 8 but had refused to take that step for some reason. Due to this she was respected and to some degree feared by all the gods including Zeus, and thus never dragged into any mess they made. According to Hephaestus, the goddess of the home was amongst the only one who treated her kindly and didn't obey Zeus's command to treat her as though she were a man. As a result, it came as little surprise that Hephaestus left the island immediately after learning of the other goddess's return. She was so eager to see her favorite aunt that she even ruined a piece she was working on in her hurry to leave. Nick did not go with her however, as he was hesitant to deal with Hestia after finding no mention of the goddess rendering aid against Zeus. In fact, Nick had a sneaking suspicion that the goddess couldn't lend aid in this regard due to her sacrificing that ability to her domains. She could act in the war between both sides before, likely because the war was devastating many homes in the process, but the conflict between Zeus and Nick was bound to be a more private sort of conflict. Still, with her return, Nick turned up his vigilance level to 11, as this meant that it likely wouldn't be long before Zeus also showed up. Strangely though, the one who set all of this in motion was nowhere to be found, as he had not taken charge of any people nor made so much as a peep. It was as though Grindelwald had entirely left the world after completing his plan. It had more than just Nick confused, as many of those in charge wondered what the Dark Lord had planned. Chapter 587, From Shadows. POV Grindelwald. I admit that it pained me to witness the sheer amount of life lost because of my actions after I completed the first part of my plan. The world transformed, and with it came a great deal of growing pains, as the people on it needed to adapt and come to terms with their new reality. As I predicted, there were a few who took charge and helped their part of the world in this regard, with the English Isle getting particularly lucky due to the presence of 2 archmages there. I did not get off scot-free from the dark acts that fueled my ritual, as I had been branded by the resentment of thousands of souls the moment of its completion. My magic wasn't gone, but under such a heavy amount of suppression from this self-imposed curse that I may as well be Muggle. It was ironic that despite my distaste for them, I now had to live like one. My followers were in the process of searching for a cure for my condition, but I knew that it was impossible for them, as I had long since known about this result. There were only 2 beings on this planet capable of lifting this curse from me, and neither would do so. The first, because they, like myself, would understand that this was my just deserts and that I deserved it. The second, however, was a being I once thought that gathering 3 artifacts would allow me to be the master of. How naive I used to be. Hades, or Death as he introduced himself throughout history, was a god, and those 3 artifacts were nothing more than items that the Peverills crafted from the knowledge they received from him. The 3 brothers had somehow contacted him and asked for knowledge from the god, who agreed for some inexplicable reason. Antioch learned of veritology, and using that knowledge created the supreme wand that grew more powerful with each user and thus made its user more powerful than any other. Ignatius learned how to summon a soul back from the afterlife and crafted a stone that held that power. Lastly, Hadrian learned how to hide from even a god's gaze and imbued this into a cloak that hid him from even death. All 3 brothers bound their artifacts to the Peveril bloodline, along with a curse that drew death's gaze to those who used it but were not of that bloodline. Antioch, much like that tale stated, bragged about his creation and was killed in his sleep by someone who wanted the wand for their own. Ignatius's story was sadder than the tale told, as he did indeed summon the soul of his wife and watched her suffer as she was rejected by the world itself. What wasn't mentioned in the tale was that eventually the strain of the magic holding her in the world, as well as the world's rejection, reached a critical point and shattered her soul. Overcome with horror and guilt, Ignatius killed himself to repent, and even rejected becoming a ghost so that he might be punished for what he did in the underworld. The stone then passed to his children, who eventually forgot its purpose and only considered the ring it was attached to an heirloom. Hadrian was the only one of the brothers to meet a good end, as he lived freely, had a family, and when he grew tired of living handed his cloak to his son before passing quietly in his sleep. You may be wondering why I knew all this now and yet not before, when it would have been helpful. The answer was because Hades, who had been obscuring the history of the objects from my ability as a seer this whole time, had allowed me to see it after I was powerless to do anything about it. I didn't hear it personally from the god's mouth, but I knew that he did this to cause me mental anguish as additional punishment for my actions. It worked too, as it forced me to see the horror of the actions I took after searching so desperately for the artifacts and finally obtaining one of them in the form of the wand. I thought that with the wand I could lead the world into a new age of magical glory with the wizards at the helm. It was arrogance pure and simple, and I learned it when Albus defeated and bound me to that oath. Then 50 years later the Ravenclaw boy suddenly came into the picture, and the future shuddered and split into 4 brand new timelines in my sight. It was incredible, and after looking at each one I could understand why the boy caused it. He grew exponentially and rapidly dragged the fates of those around him alongside his own from his sheer momentum and mass. Chapter 588, Fortifications. Normal POV. Nick immediately started to move things away from his island in secret after Hestia appeared in America. The place he moved it to was a bit cheeky on his part, as he directly had Hephaestus teleport him to the moon, where he dug deep into the celestial object and created a huge set of caves that he reinforced and isolated from the vacuum space outside of it. He then started introducing an atmosphere like that of Earth into the cave system alongside plants and magical fans to keep the air breathable and circulating. Beyond that, Nick had Hephaestus help him cover every inch of the place with wards to prevent even a god from finding the place without exact coordinates. She was especially skilled at this, as she had spent a large amount of time keeping her work away from the other gods, who were either curious about what she did or were Zeus making sure she wasn't planning to rebel again and ruin another god's plans. More than a few times Hera learned of his indiscretions because Hephaestus told her mother, knowing it would get him in trouble. Needless to say, the relationship between father and daughter was very love-hate, as the father loved the skill of the daughter but hated her as an individual. This secret moon base was going to be Nick's escape place should Zeus come looking for him once Nick set up a teleportation method back to the island. The method he chose was something he had to buy from the system for a good 200,000 points, portal gates. Portal gates were basically a set of doorways that connected 2 points in space so that you could walk through one gate and walk out the other regardless of how far away the other gate was. In a manner of speaking, this was actually just an advanced usage of spatial magic that had been set in the form of an enchantment that needed a password to use. Creating the gates themselves was the only part Hephaestus was interested in, as she didn't care about the spatial magics at all. Still, the gates needed to be made in a specific manner that interested her, and so the work on them was split between her and Nick. The final product was a set of 2 circular archways with 12 symbols on their faces and a slider that moved to select the symbols that made up the password. Once selected, the archways were glow for a moment as a silver mirror-looking plane of energy covered the entire inside of them before showing what was on the other side of the opposite archway. Satisfied with this, Nick placed one of these gates in his moon base and started moving his stuff there while leaving the stuff he was willing to lose behind. It made no difference to Hephaestus whether she was on the island or on the moon crafting stuff, so Nick basically cleaned out the whole manor minus some decoy equipment of far lesser quality than his real stuff. Dottie and Lucas were confused about this but didn't raise a fuss about it since it didn't really affect them very much. Sirius and the other governmental people were the same, as they noticed it, and after getting assurances that Nick wasn't about to abandon everyone at the city, chose to ignore it. Nick made sure to step up the defenses and preparations of the city as far as he could in the meanwhile, which everyone was completely okay with as it made them feel safer. It also lightened the load on the patrols so that they could relax, as the defenses would hold against even the strongest beast, for a while anyways. It was still too soon for Tier 5 beasts to start showing up en masse, so Tier 4 was the strongest any normal beast got at the moment. A few talented dragons or other powerful creatures had of course reached Tier 5, but they were barely more than a handful across the globe. This whole process took another 3 months, and as if perfectly on time, when Beltane arrived, the mana spiked again before settling back to the new normal and loud thunder was heard all over the world. Zeus was back. Hephaestus had grown more powerful after learning all she could of Nick's crafting styles, but even still she appeared nervous at the sound. Like the tyrannical person he is, Zeus made sure that the whole world knew of his return, and for a brief moment Nick felt a few of his own domains resonate with the Skyfathers before the god stopped showing off. He wasn't sure if the god had felt them himself, but wasn't willing to risk it as he went to the moon immediately. Chapter 589, Clash. As it turned out, the answer to that question was yes, he did in fact feel it as well. But Zeus also felt that Nick's domains weren't worth mentioning compared to his own, and chose to ignore it until the 3 unexpected variables were taken care of. Zeus had been under the impression before he sealed himself away that he would be the only god left, and yet he noticed that there were 3 in reality. This ruined his plans, as he was going to recreate his pantheon perfectly this time, none of that defiance this go around. Learning that 2 of the still living gods were his older sister, whom he had no hope of challenging, and his older brother, who he was always cautious of due to his domains, meant that this plan needed to be scrapped to a degree. It was frustrating, but he was adaptable if nothing else, so turned his attention to the goddess that he could do something about, Hephaestus. She felt his approach long before he actually arrived, as a violent storm began to brew in the sky overhead, but she didn't want to face Zeus above the island, as it would be entirely destroyed if she did so. Hephaestus instead chose to grab her hammer that she used as her weapon and charge out of the island to meet her father above the open ocean. She saw him standing in the sky arrogantly when she arrived. Zeus was a tall, muscular man with stark white hair and a full beard that alongside his angular face made him appear older than he should. In his right hand a glowing golden spear that bore the likeness of a bolt of lightning. The wind howled around him and flashes of lightning fell from the nearby sky. "I hadn't expected you to come face your death with such courage. Perhaps you are not as much of a mistake as I assumed. This is your only chance, submit to me and I will let you live to serve once again." Zeus spoke fiercely with a deep voice and hard expression. Hephaestus scowled. "I refuse," she yelled as she unleashed the full extent of her power while swinging her hammer forward. Zeus's eyes widened as he noticed that her power was only slightly weaker than his own rather than at the lower end of godhood like it used to be. A vast amount of power slammed into him since he was caught off guard by this revelation, and the sea parted around the strike's power, revealing the seabed miles below that cracked when he struck it. Hephaestus knew that was not enough to kill or even truly harm him all that badly, and sent blow after blow down upon Zeus to capitalize on her advantage. The seabed cracked further and further while the world itself shook ever so slightly with each blow. "Enough!" Zeus screamed angrily and exploded outwards with his full power. A massive crater was created from this outburst on the seabed as he shot up towards Hephaestus, aiming his spear at her murderously. The spear glowed blindingly as he filled it with his power and thrust it forward mid-charge. Hephaestus filled her hammer with her own power and brought it down to meet the thrust head-on. The spearhead met the hammerhead and a shockwave like a nuke going off erupted from the clash of forces. "You think you can win this? How naive!" Zeus yelled spitefully. "I don't need to win. I just don't need to lose." Hephaestus sent back and Zeus finally figured out what she was going for as his face turned bright red with his eyes going bloodshot and his veins throbbing on his forehead. "Why? Why does everything stand in my way? Mark my words, this isn't over," he roared before shooting off into the distance. Hephaestus wasn't here to fight to the death like he assumed but rather to leave him weakened so that he was vulnerable for someone else to finish off. Even worse was that she could truly kill him with her current level of power as his lightning domain was by its nature weak to her metal one. Metal redirects even the mightiest bolt of lightning as it was lightning's nature to take the path of least resistance. Zeus had been careful in making sure that no god with that domain approached his power level to prevent this exact scenario. He was proud and reckless at first appearances but the truth was he was very smart and knew his weaknesses well. While Hephaestus's metal domain wasn't at the same level as his lightning, her raw power made up that difference, so as irritating as it was they were at a tie. Chapter 590, Unknown Skip. Hephaestus didn't chase her father as he left even if he had threatened her with every intention of fulfilling it. Thanks to the book written by her grandfather, she knew that the fate of putting an end to him belonged to Nick alone at this moment. If he failed, then it may become someone else's fate in the future, but for now it didn't do to dwell on it. She returned to the island and informed Nick that Zeus wouldn't be a problem for a while, but he will definitely be back. This was a relief for Nick as he was nowhere near tier 6, much less to a power level that would allow him to face Zeus. "How long do you think we have before he returns even stronger?" he asked seriously. "It depends on luck, as if he is lucky then he will make a breakthrough in his domains within a year, and if he is unlucky it may take over 10 before he makes enough progress to feel confident in his victory," she said honestly, and Nick frowned at that timetable. A year might be enough to reach tier 6 if he rushes a bit, but he doubted that even 100 years was enough to get to tier 7. "You appear concerned, why?" Hephaestus asked, confused after seeing his expression. "My progress has slowed down considerably after reaching tier 5, so while I think I can reach tier 6 within a year, I don't think I could reach tier 7 within a century," Nick said honestly. "I believe you are under a misconception. You are already tier 7, or at least partially at that point," she said, and Nick froze. "Explain," he demanded. Tier 5 was transforming one's mana into their domains, but tier 6 is transforming oneself into a pure energy state comprised of one's domains. You have already turned yourself into a pure energy state and only lack the addition of your domains, which should occur the moment your mana is finished being transformed. This is why I said you were a god waiting to be made. You are already almost guaranteed to ascend to tier 7 the moment your mana is completely transformed," she explained with a grin. "So you were messing with me when you said I would understand the moment I got there," Nick said in mock outrage. How could he possibly be mad when he had just received absolutely spectacular news? No wonder it was so bloody hard to understand. "I basically skipped the 2 tiers before 7 that is meant to prepare one to become divine and set myself on the same existential plane as a god directly. I'm just playing catch up at this point," Nick thought with a self-deprecative chuckle. He was so concerned about the amount of time it would take him to become strong enough to threaten Zeus that he hadn't even realized the massive shortcut he had already taken. With this new understanding, Nick was much more relaxed and didn't feel so pressed for time anymore. Even if he didn't push it forward, Nick was sure that he would reach the end of tier 5 in 2 years at most, and a little under a year if he sped it up. "Do you think it would be better to improve my domains as I wait for my mana to naturally finish converting over, or to use my time for another purpose?" he asked, and she turned thoughtful. "The stronger your domains, the more powerful you'll be upon reaching godhood, so even if it slows you down you can't be mistaken improving them while you can," she said helpfully. "I suppose I ought to finish up the next crafting style I devised then," Nick said, deciding to finally cash in that free crafting style he had been sitting on. Originally he wanted to master or get close to mastering the Twilight style, but with Hephaestus's help on it they had already pushed it just about as far as was possible, as besides figuring out how to fuse the material into other enchantments they had already grasped everything about it. "Oh? What's it about?" Hephaestus asked excitedly and pressed against him, eager to hurry him up in answering. She didn't have huge breasts because it would get in the way of her work, but she still had a nice-sized bust that she was now pressing against Nick's arm. His mind short-circuited for a moment as he was rendered speechless before he snapped out of it and separated himself from her awkwardly. "It's not done yet, so you will just have to wait," he said, trying and failing to keep the redness off his face.
Thanks for listening.